Welcome to Not Another CEO podcast. I'm your host, David Politis. Every week, we talk to inspiring leaders and get the true stories, the ups and downs, the lessons learned, and come away with actionable advice for our own journeys. Today's guest is a thought leader and authority on executive management, leadership development, and how the best CEOs operate. He was a journalist for over 30 years, created the corner office column for the New York Times. He interviewed over 500 CEOs for that column over the course of almost a decade. I think I've actually read almost every one of those interviews. You could say he's the GOAT when it comes to interviewing CEOs. Actually, the corner office column was the inspiration for this podcast. He's written 4 books on leadership: Quick and Nimble, The CEO Test, Leap to Leader, and The Corner Office. He continues to interview leaders, and he now publishes those interviews on LinkedIn. In 2017, he joined a firm that does executive coaching and leadership development for some of the biggest and best companies in the world. Please welcome Senior Managing Director at the ExCo Group, Adam Bryant.
David, great to see you again. Always enjoy our conversation. So I've been looking forward to this.
Awesome. I think I told you this, but really, the corner office forever. I read it for a decade, and then when I took a step back from operating day to day, and I wanted to share back with the community, that was the inspiration, the format for this. Of like, let's not talk about people's companies. Let's talk about leadership and talk about them and their background. So thank you for being that inspiration, being a friend to me, and helping me as I've been getting this off the ground.
Of course. And one of the joys of doing corner office for that all those years was getting to meet people like you. So I'm an introvert, so networking doesn't come naturally to me. So interviewing CEOs and so many great friendships have come out of it.
It's awesome. That my parents, I think, still have that article framed in their house in Israel. So
great. Means a lot.
So let's first thing, so you've interviewed, hundreds for the corner office, but then hundreds more at ExCo and worked with all these great CEOs. What do you think are the common attributes across the best CEOs that you've interviewed and worked with?
Sure. And, it's one of those things we could talk for hours about this. You sort of need 300 skills like to be an effective CEO. But if I had to pick 3, I think I would start with you have to be able to simplify complexity. It's just sort of a requirement, a skill, a habit of mind, because I think a lot of leadership does come down to those moments, right? And it's like you on a stage at an all hands meeting, and you kind of have to answer the kind of questions that little kids ask in the back seat, right? Like, where are we going? How are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? Right. And what are the challenges we're going to face? And so that ability as a leader to be able to take the complexity of the world, their industry, their company, and just boil it down to folks, where we're going. These are the 3 main things we're going to do to win. These are the hills we got to overcome. This is how we're going to keep score. To be able to do that, you simply have to be able to do that if you're going to be an effective leader. The second thing I'll mention is, I think it's become more important in the last 4 years, but just this whole notion of authenticity and who are you as a leader? We're hearing all these words about humanity and vulnerability and transparency. What does that really mean? And I also go back to one of those leadership moments. You're on a stage, if somebody asked you, who are you as a leader? Just having a clear answer for what you would say. And I don't tell people how to answer that question, but I do have a framework, which is, I think you stand up there and say, look, I really appreciate the question. These are the 3 values that are most important to me as a leader. And you don't just stop there. You have to explain why they're important to you. Because it's very easy to play, fridge magnet poetry and come up with a bunch of words that sound good, right? But to make them real, you have to say, look, these are the values that are important to me. And I want to tell you the stories about how they became important to me. And then ideally, you can tie those into the company's own values and mission. And I think that really gives some dimension to you as a leader. And the third thing I'll mention, I always think about leadership as a series of paradoxes or contradictions or balancing acts. It's never about one thing. And I think to be an effective leader, you have to be comfortable in those paradoxes and those balancing acts. You've got to be confident but humble. You've got to be compassionate but demanding. And it's all about like knowing contextually what the right response is. And the one I've been thinking a lot about lately is, especially where there's so much disruption, so much uncertainty in the world, I think one of the toughest paradoxes for leaders is to have the confidence and the courage to make a decision, to make a bet, right? To say, we're going left, we're not going right. Yet at the same time, always be challenging your own assumptions about that. Cause, we've all met people who are like super confident, but they don't really question themselves, right? And some people question themselves so much that it's paralyzing and they actually can't make a decision. And so I think the best leaders can make a decision, yet at the same time are always saying, is it the right decision, right? Is there something that we're not thinking about? So to me, if I had to call out three things, it would be those things,
Mm.
like simplifying complexity, being clear on what authenticity means and like how you would answer that. And thirdly, just being comfortable in these paradoxes.
It's interesting because I think when you say those things, I imagine the CEOs that I've interviewed, that I've interacted with, and those three things, it actually doesn't matter what industry, what size, what country. Like those three things are so like you can boil it down. It's really interesting because actually I think the authenticity actually of all of those things, that for me is something that I think is hard for a lot of especially first time leaders and CEOs because they feel like they have to be someone different than who they naturally are. They almost feel like I have to be the leader and I have to present myself in this way, otherwise people aren't going to respect me. And maybe they don't even realize that that's how people already see them just by their title. And it's almost the authenticity that they need to bring it back to being a real human being. I don't know. Does that make sense?
It totally doesn't. And I think some of the other traps that people fall into, one is what you just mentioned. It's like, I'm a CEO, I'm a leader now. It's almost like they have to put on a suit, right? And
Yeah.
become somebody that they're not. And people can smell that from a mile away, right? So that's not going to work. I think another trap people fall into is like, okay, I'm got to be authentic, right? So I'm in a really bad mood today, but I want to be authentic. So I want everybody to know I'm in a bad
Mm,
mood, right? And that's not what authenticity means. And I'm borrowing this from one of our coaches at my firm, but he had this great insight. He said, authenticity, what it really means is that people perceive you as you want them to perceive you, right? Because there's often a gap between how we think we're showing up in the world and how people perceive us. Like that's just natural. That's always there. But as much as you can close that gap that people are seeing you the way you want them to see you, that's authenticity, right? Like there's some, being intentional about what you want to project about yourself as a leader. And I think that's a good framework too, because again, a lot of people just think, well, authenticity, it's like, I had a really bad day and everybody's going to know it.
yeah, the other one that resonates a lot with me is the simplifying these complex concepts or situations or issues. And when you say on stage, I think about myself and my career. In the early part of my career, I would get on stage or in front of my team and share all the detail and all the messy stuff. And I felt like if I make it too simple, I'm not treating them with enough kind of trust or respect and they're not going to get it. But then you realize I'm talking to hundreds of people and you have to come in at some lowest common denominator to get everyone behind a single thing. And that took me a long time actually to get to a place where I could simplify it and feel like it was still deep enough that it could be useful. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's such a good point. And I heard a wonderful sort of metaphor or insight from a CEO that nails the point that you just described. And his thing was that you could have a room full of Einsteins, literally the smartest people on the planet. But there's some quirk about the human brain, like the bigger the audience, the more the collective IQ drops. Right. And so you have to like, three bullet points, big fonts, like keep it super simple. a guy named Marcus Ryu, who was CEO of
Oh god.
Guidewire, but
Oh yeah,
he
yeah.
told me that, and honestly, I've thought about it ever since, and it's so true, right? Like again, super smart people, one on one, they would be totally with you while you're giving them that complexity, but there's something about a bigger audience. You just have to keep it simple.
Yeah. Wow. Marcus, I saw him speak at an event earlier this year, and he's the only speaker ever that I actually ran to after their talk ever. And I said to him, Marcus, that was the best presentation I've ever seen on entrepreneurship, founding a company. He had this great slide. I don't know if you saw it. They put up like a video recently about it. He had this great slide that he said he showed at every all hands, and it was a picture of a guy doing a pickaxe into a mountain face. And he said every all hands he would show the pickaxe picture.
Yeah.
And he said inevitably every all hand the new person some new person would say, wow, okay, what are we digging toward, what's on the other side of the rock face? And he said, more rock. And
Right.
it was the best line I ever, and he and anyway, that's a really good, I like that, because I do think that's the thing. Like when I've been most successful, I've been able to boil down everything to that
Yeah.
one thing, that one goal. And so I love that. Next question for me is, like, when you think about these attributes, and you've interviewed a lot of CEOs, but now you've also interviewed a lot of leaders of HR, and there's like a bunch of people. Do you think that you can be taught these attributes? Can you be taught to be a leader? Can you be taught to these attributes?
I think a lot of the skills of being a leader you can teach, right? Because look, I've been in the leadership space about 15 years. I could give you my rant about how I think a lot of leadership advice is not helpful, right? And misses the mark for various reasons. But you know, like part of being a leader is understanding like what strategy means, right? We just talked about simplifying complexity. You can teach people a useful framework for how to think about strategy, right? And you can give people frameworks and insights about building teams and culture. And that's kind of what I traffic in, right? Like I love soaking up people's wisdom from people like you and sharing it with the rest of the world, because I think that's what like learning how to be a leader is about. It's like, how do you shorten that learning curve? Right. And leadership ultimately is sort of about wisdom, right? Like either I've seen this movie before, or I read something, or I heard a story from someone about the movie that I'm living through right now. So I can kind of step back and identify it, maybe even steer it to a better outcome. Um, so I think you can give people a lot of those insights and frameworks to be a more effective leader. What I think is more a sort of on the nature side, the things people are born with are that drive, right? And it's not just you're born with. I mean, I've interviewed by now more than 1,000 leaders, and I'm conducting my own sort of informal social experiment, trying to understand like why do people want these jobs, right? Because on paper, like why would anybody want them, right? Like you did it for years,
Mhm.
right? It's a hard job. You
Terrible
got
job.
like you got a million bricks. You got a million bricks on your back. You got to meet payroll. Everybody's got some problem that, they're putting at your feet. Like they are really, again, like on paper, it's easy to step back and say, why would anybody want these jobs? And we can talk about that, but I think like there's people have these sort of different motivations and reasons to want those. And I don't think you can teach
Mm,
those. Like you've got to be, for whatever the different reasons are, but you've got to be wired to choose the harder path, right? Because as human beings, we don't necessarily do that. I read a book this summer. What's his name? Haruki Murakami, a novelist, but he actually wrote a book about running and his because I needed some motivation to sort of get my running big game back. But there was a great line in there. He's talking about the human brain. He said the human brain is a bargain hunter. And he talked about it just means like it's always just sort of wired to always look for the easier path, right? And that's great because through evolution it leads to innovation, right? Like how do we get that rock up this hill? Oh, let's build a machine, right? Like that's good. But I think a lot of people are like not wired to necessarily take the harder
mm,
path. So you have to ask yourself, why do CEOs, why do leaders who are always taking these greater challenges, why do they do that? And that again, that's kind of like a informal social experiment I've been, or at least trying to understand that.
Well, you
Um,
in the interviews, you always would ask people their back. You always ask people their background, where they come from, and
yeah,
their parents. And so, what is that? What is that common background that you see that gives people the crazy idea to go do this job?
I have somewhere between like 3 or 4 broad categories, and again, like, I'm not holding this up as like a, like peer-reviewed research, right? But I'm just saying, like, this is qualitative data, and I have interviewed more than 1,000 leaders, so that's where I'm coming from. So the biggest category to me is, people who faced adversity early in their life. And there is, I have just heard so many stories of people who grew up in tough circumstances, alcoholic parents. I've heard from so many people the same story where, they may have been growing up in a comfortable middle class lifestyle. And then the father died from a heart attack at a young age. The mother didn't work and didn't have life insurance. So suddenly the family is like everybody's scrambling to put food on the table. And so many people have, there was one guy interviewed, and he said, I never wanted to put my own family in that same position. So I think there's these experiences. I mean, not to get too like, therapists, but I think people have these experiences earlier in their life where they feel like it's almost like at their bone marrow, just getting like zapped with this horrible experience. And then they make a decision like, I'm never going to feel that again. Right. And I want to have more control over my destiny and my life. And so from then, like, some people get knocked down and they stay down, and some people get knocked down. They say, like, I'm getting up and I'm not getting knocked down again. Right. And so there's that drive that comes from that. Um, so I think that's to me one of the big categories. Another one is some version of the immigrant stories. And I don't mean that literally, but it's sort of this idea of like the first to be on the path. So the story I've heard from many leaders is like, my parents came to this country and I was the first in the family to go to college. Right. And I was the first in the family to do X. And I think when you're always the first in the family to do something, at some point that becomes like your comfort zone, right? Like being on that path and forging that path, you actually get comfortable doing it. And so leadership is a natural outgrowth of that, right? Like I've never done this before, but I'll figure it out, right? There's a sort of comfort level that comes with that. I think the third category is people who've hit the parent lottery, just like great parents that were terrific influences. Maybe the father or mother was an entrepreneur. And so just sitting around the dinner table, hearing those stories. I've heard a lot of people tell me about parents who were interesting sort of pairs, right? So like the entrepreneur father, the artist mother, or, one of them was ran their own business, but the other was like a psychologist. So you get that EQ and IQ. And so interesting, like I've heard that a lot. And then the final category is I think some people are just born with just so much energy, right? And it's almost like the skin exists just to contain that volcanic energy, and business is just a vehicle, right? It's like an outlet to do something and have an impact. And those are kind of my 4 categories. I don't know if you've met so many of them.
I think that captures pretty much every backstory that I've gotten so far is something
Yeah.
in those 4. My own story definitely comes from hitting the parent lottery mixed with the immigrant story, first generation. It's kind of both combined, maybe with the energy as well. I don't know, but I but I it's a but to your point, everyone to do it, what you do find is there's something from one of those things that is so deeply embedded, you said, like in their bone marrow, you can feel it when I asked the question. I'm sure you saw this every time you would ask the question, when you were interviewing people, like you can feel it that there's something, and if you ask them, they know what that, like they will say,
Yeah.
this thing is stuck in my head and it's there every day, and that's what drives me. But that's probably the most concise way I've heard the
Yeah. That's
summary
great.
of the backgrounds.
Yeah. And I was talking to one of our mentors the other day, and he was sharing his story, and it was in that first category, faced a lot of adversity when he was younger, and he said something that just kind of like was really stayed with me. And it is about that. Like if you feel something, that adversity at a young age, it's kind of like, I don't want to ever feel that again. Right. And so this one of our coaches, a CEO for many years, she said to me, it's like winning for me in business is not a game. It's existential.
Mm,
And it's just like, wow, okay, like now I get it, right? Because again, you just like I've been using this metaphor, like if you've had experiences when you're younger where you feel like your bone marrow got fried, like it was that deep in terms of like what you felt and went through, you can imagine like, yeah, and everybody's got their stuff, right? Everybody's got their baggage. Everybody's faced some level of adversity, but like the really tough stuff, I can see it motivating people. It's like, I never, not only do I never want to feel that again, I'm never gonna feel that
mm,
again.
mm. Um, just I want to talk about that energy one that you mentioned. You shared with me a concept that you called OBOB that I would love if you could share with the listeners because I've been using it now, and I always give you credit. I tell it to
Right.
so many people. Can you share that concept?
Sure, sure. And I drive my poor family crazy with it because my brain works in acronyms. So I came up with this acronym OBOB or OBOB. And what it stands for optimal band of busyness. And it's the context for this is, my age, my network, whatever, but I find myself, I've been having a lot of conversations with people who are moving from like a full-time 24/7 operating job to their next chapter, call it retirement, whatever. But some people have a rocky adjustment. And what I've realized, and partly, just some self awareness on my part, I just came up with this idea that we all have this optimal band of busyness. Like, where if you're in that band, like you just feel like, yeah, this is good. I've got a lot going on and this is about as busy as I want to be. And if you go above that band, that's when stress comes in. Like you're just stressed out, you're juggling, you're spinning too many plates. That's not optimal. Right. But the other thing too is like sometimes when people retire, like they suddenly go from this 24/7, 100-mile an hour job to basically like a 20 or 30-mile an hour life, and they get depressed, they get cranky, the gears start grinding and all that. And so what I always tell people is like, first of all, like be aware that you have an OBOB. Everyone's is different, but whatever you do, try and fill up your life with stuff so that you are operating in that band, because then you're going to be happier. You're going to be more productive. You're going to feel like you're kind of in the zone. And especially for successful people who have, um, build companies
Yeah.
like you, right? Like you have earned the right to do what more of what you want to do rather than what you should do and need to do. And it's just like, just being aware of that band and building that portfolio life so that you got enough stuff going on so that you're happy.
Mhm.
Right. And so that's my OBOB
I
theory.
love it. I think when you to me it's like being in the zone. That is the perfect way to describe it because we talked early on when I was trying to figure out what am I going to fill my time with, and when we were talking I was right there coming out of maybe the bottom part of that zone where I was feeling kind of depressed. I don't get depressed and I was feeling kind of depressed by not having enough stuff to sink my teeth into. And I had friends saying to me, "Why don't you just golf? Like, why don't you just?" And I said, "I don't go. I actually never golfed. And they said, "Yeah, but you should just do that every day." I said, "I'll go. I'll
Right.
actually." Like I may go crazy, and and when we talked, it clicked for me. I went immediately and told my wife, "Listen to this thing Adam said." Oh, Bob, and that's been what I'm sharing with a lot of I'm in this group called Post Exit Founders, and it's
Oh, that's great.
2,500 founders who have exited their company at one level or another. And this is the number one topic in that
Yeah.
group, other than investing, whatever. The number one topic is how do I get in the zone? How did you get
Right.
in the zone? Should I,
Right.
is the zone here for me up here or down here? And there's all these threads about exactly that. And it's yeah, it's so spot on when you described it to me immediately. I was like, yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think part of the challenge too, because again, whether it's wiring or the nature of the job or whatever. The other metaphor I use for myself, just in the spirit of self-awareness, like I say, I have a wood chipper brain, right? Like it's just sort of kind of
Mm.
constantly on, and I need to put a lot of like wood into it to sort of keep it busy and productive, because otherwise, like my arms and legs are going to get caught in the wood chipper. And I was sharing this story with a friend of mine, and he just like stopped me. He goes, you just described my brain in a way that I've never understood it, and just in terms of, he got me this little like Tonka toy wood chipper that I now have on my desk. So
That's great. Um, I want to transition a little bit to team dynamics, because I think that one of the things that I'm hearing in a lot of these interviews is a lot of discussion about getting the right team. And in many cases, people talking about, I got this amazing executive, but they didn't fit with the team. And um, I want to just, I think we haven't prepared this. I think that I remember you telling me that you used to do this exercise with executive teams, where you would give them, I feel like you told me you'd give them a corner office article, maybe, or something, and you had each of them look at it and give their take. There was something you told me about, and to get everyone sharing kind of that authentic,
yeah,
self. Can you know what I'm talking about? I don't know if I'm.
yeah, yeah, sure. And to me, like the big idea is that, well, let me start at the beginning, which is that I think sometimes people in business or organizations more broadly, they're kind of like kidding themselves, because I think there's this idea of like, you get, 8 or 10 strangers around the table and you say, okay, you guys are a high performing team now, like go, right? And it's just not going to happen, right? Because there's power dynamics, right? And everybody wants more resources and FaceTime with this. So you have to like acknowledge those. I mean, as I get older, I always feel like the phrase dysfunctional family is redundant, right? Like, isn't every family dysfunctional at some level? And if that is true, then isn't every team going to be dysfunctional as well?
Mm,
Certainly at the beginning. So I think a big part of it is just to acknowledge it, right? And, I interviewed one CEO. She said when she became CEO of the team, she said, look, guys, we're going to be clunky, right? We need to work through this. Everybody has the permission to ask why, right? Like, of your colleagues, like, why do we do that? I thought that was a great tactic. But for me, the key goal when we work with teams is like to try and get them to see each other as human beings rather than colleagues, right? Because you need that sort of firm foundation of like, I see you as a human being, and then to build on there, like, because every team says the same thing. It's like, yes, teams like, what do you guys want? It's like, we want to have each other's back, right? It means trust, and that's what everybody wants. But like, how do you get there? And I think part of it starts with sort of that foundation of understanding you as a human being, is just being vulnerable. Like, whether it's, you and I have been talking about the stories that influenced you as a leader, right? And you sort of go around the table and just that simple question, like, what was the early thing in your life that really shaped
mm,
how you show up today? And if people lean into that question, like, it's like, wow, I never would have expected that. And, you get a box of Kleenex because people start telling stories and they learn that it's like, I went through that too. I had no idea about that about you. Right. And so you do that, you and I know about the leadership user
yep.
manual exercise, like, be open about the fact that, look, I'm an introvert. I prefer emails to phone calls because I need time to think. And somebody might prefer brainstorming in person. But just as much as you can share about like who you are as a human being and how that shows up at work, your preferred work styles, your quirks, we're all human beings. We all have our quirks, our pet peeves. Boy, if you can like use that as the foundation of the team, then you can build from there.
Mm,
But I just think it's like, you got to acknowledge that, because again, you put, super successful people around the team, a table who are ambitious, there's going to be a lot of power dynamics, right? And there's always going to be that. You can't make them go away. But I think this idea of like trust, to me, is like that big word that I would put at the top of the whiteboard list of what you need for effective leadership. And we can spend hours unpacking what that word means, but I think you have to figure out how do you get there?
Hmm. You know that when you say trust, have each other's back. We did a team building exercise. I don't know, a number of years ago, and the person moderating it, they had everyone. They said, "Okay, everyone, close your eyes. Think about the team that you've been a part of, the most successful team that you've been a part of. Okay, now we're going to go around. Can you tell me what the team was and tell me why it was the most successful?" Run around the table, and it was so interesting. And everyone went around. Almost every person said a sports team that they were on of some sort in high school, in elementary school. And the answers were trust, we loved each other, we this, it, around the table. And at the end, the question was, okay, did anything say skill? Did anything it actually literally no one said those words, which is especially when talking about, the undefeated basketball team, whatever, but no one said skills. They Everything had to do with having each other's back. And that was a huge eye-opening experience for me, because you do realize it all that is the foundation. At least teams I've been a part of, you don't spend enough time doing that deliberately, you know?
Yeah. 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 And because again, like a big component of trust is vulnerability, right? And being open about the stuff that you are going through, that you went through, that shaped you as a leader. I've had so many moments where I'm facilitating those meetings and people share stories and you're just like, oh my God, right? Like I'm saying this, I just met them, but even their colleagues is like, I had no idea that you went through that. Right, and you just there is true magic in that where people you can feel the energy change in the room. It's like, I see you as a human being now, not just a colleague that I'm competing with.
This is a very tactile question, but how do you get people to open up like that? I mean, do does the CEO go first and do it first, so that, like, how do you get, because I've done some where people do that, and I've done some where we're not going to the level that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and I've had a couple of those, and I always make the CEO or the senior person in the room go last, right?
Go
Because
last.
you want them, and what I also do is, I've got a deck of slides because I've heard a lot of stories from CEOs over the years where, like, I will set the context rather than just saying, "Okay, everybody, be vulnerable, go." Like, it's not going to happen, right? Like, you have to sort of explain the conceit, and show quotes and tell stories from people who've done this. Sometimes, I'll talk about my own whatever, but just like you have to kind of role model the
Mm,
behavior.
mm,
But I think like just that very specific question of what, what was an early experience or influence that really shaped how you show up on a team today. Right. And then just saying, look, everybody here has got their baggage, right? We all do. We're human beings. We've all faced adversity in some, and we learn a lot from that adversity. And very often that influences how we show up
mm.
in workplace and on teams. So what's your story? And I generally find like 97% of the time, you do enough context setting, you do enough, and people want to have that
Hmm.
conversation.
Let's talk about the user manual. So that was something that I went to a CEO conference that you put on. I think there was a couple hundred amazing CEOs in the room. And you took us through this exercise of doing the user manual. You talked about it a little bit. Can you maybe extrapolate a little bit more there and talk about that some more?
Yeah. And like, I don't get these ideas like waking up at the middle of the night. I mean, this is from a CEO named Ivar Krogred that who I interviewed years ago, but he called it leadership user manual. And the whole idea, I mean, the simplest way for me to explain it is like, Dave, like you and I know each other, right? To some degree, we had a lot of good conversations, but let's say you and I became colleagues, right? And if you think that, then you ask yourself, well, what do we know for certain? We know for certain that it's probably going to take you and me 3 to 6 months to figure each other out, right? Like, because again, we're human beings. We all have our quirks, we're pet peeves. We like, communication styles, expectations, all those other things. And it's going to take us 3 to 6 months through trial and error, maybe even some teeth grinding conversations, like misunderstandings, talking, oh, that's why you do that. Now I get, and so that is inevitable. And so the whole point of the user manual is to try and shorten that learning curve. So on the first day of you and I officially becoming colleagues, I say, David, really excited about working with you. What should I know about you? Just in terms of like how you like to work, your styles, your preferences, your pet peeves, like what's going to earn me an extra gold star with you. And we have that conversation. And ideally it's a two-way street. You ask about me. And then it's like, okay, I can work with that. Right. Like, and it doesn't come from a place of arrogance. Like you've got to, peel my grapes before I eat them. Like it's not that silly stuff, right? It's all in the context of we share the same goal of driving after these big goals together. But the quicker we can figure each other out, um, the more we can like focus on the work rather than trying to figure each other out. And to me, like that's another hallmark of best teams, right? Like people, like, okay, I can, we've all got our quirks and I can honor yours, right? Your preferences and all that. All those are reasonable. You're doing the same to me. And again, that gets at the core of like trust and vulnerability. And a big component of trust is predictability, right? So understand who I am and why I am this way. And then you go like, yeah, I can work with that. Let's go after our big goals now.
Mm.
So that's the point of it.
Yeah. Well, I remember I tell, that it's like my first LinkedIn post that went viral was when I came back from the conference. And I remember sitting there, you leading us through it, a room of 200 something CEOs, and you told everyone, here's some questions, go ahead and start writing the answers. Room goes absolutely silent. Everyone heads down. And I remember very distinctly when you told people to stop and to after no one stopped because people, it was like therapy, I think, for everyone in the room. And
Right.
everyone, I remember distinctly, you're like, okay, now we're gonna like actually share with each other. And everyone was still, I remember me and the person next to me, we were sitting there writing. And then
Yeah.
when you said, okay, now turn to the person next to you and start sharing yours. And we did that and we didn't stop. No one wanted to stop because it was this like, and since then I've done it at a bunch of companies, my own and others. I've shared with them, and it's always the same thing. It's like as much as it's good for the other person, it's also in many ways the author feels better when it's all out there, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's kind of like the cork being released because you finally given somebody a framework to share all these pet peeves that they have in
Yes,
their head,
yeah,
right? And they're like, I can't really share, this, but it's just like it's a very human framework for having what might be a difficult conversation, but it just starts with like, look, this is my stuff, right? Like you got your stuff, I got
yeah,
this is my stuff,
yeah.
right? And
I did it at a company. I led a company through a small leadership group, and one of the people, I said, anyone want to share? And one person said, yes. I hate when people are on their computer during meetings because I feel like they're not listening to me, and it really frustrates me. And then someone else said, I'd like to share. I swear this is the next person. They said, well, I really hate when people think that I'm not listening to them in meetings because I'm on my computer taking notes. It was I swear that in a group of like 12 very senior leaders, but it was this thing where they neither of them they probably this was like their chance to like air this feelings with each other. But I bet
yeah,
after that they both were much more productive in their meetings and weren't thinking the whole time, why is that person on their laptop and why is that person angry
yeah,
at me?
yeah, yeah. No, it's wonderful.
Um, I want to talk a little bit about just the corner office. Like you were you were a journalist for many years, and you were before you started the corner office. What gave you the idea or the push to start it?
Yeah. So I was a journalist for 30 years and about 15 years as a reporter and 15 years as an editor, managing teams of reporters on different desks at the New York Times and also Newsweek magazine. But Corner was the idea for it started with all the years that I was a business reporter and I interviewed a lot of CEOs and when I was interviewing them, it was sort of the traditional way that business reporters interviewed CEOs back then, right? Like this was in the 90s. So you sit down with a CEO and it's like, you sort of like study their company strategy and the competitive landscape. And,
Mm,
you sort of asking them the usual questions about that. And that was fine, right? Like there's an audience for that stuff, certainly back then. But I just found myself when I was meeting with these CEOs, I just became really intrigued with them as people, right? Like they seem to have really fast brains, most of them. And there's some wisdom there and sense of humor. And so this feeling just sort of kept building. And I finally asked myself a very simple question, which is, what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies? And instead ask them about like those early influences that shaped them, the key leadership lessons they've learned, how they navigate the universal challenges of leadership, like hiring and building teams and culture and all that, and how they hire, and best career and life advice for new college grads. And so that was that sort of simple question that maybe not so much now, but back then was very much a departure from how CEOs were interviewed. Um, and so I kind of knew in my gut that it would work. Maybe some of my colleagues were skeptical, but I remember quite vividly after I interviewed the first CEO and I walked out of the building where his office was, and I said to myself, "This is going to work." And it's been a wonderful adventure. I mean, the amount of like wisdom that I've absorbed from people like you and the stories, the memorable stories and really great, whether it's acronyms or insights or tips or how do you deal with this? And I've just learned a ton and made some lifelong friends along the way.
And I know it's probably an unfair question to ask you. Do you have a favorite? I'm sure people have asked you this. Do you have a favorite interview?
I don't, and partly because I just not everybody. There have been a few interviews. I will tell you that like I did not run, just because the person didn't understand the focus, even though I was quite explicit on the front end. But I just find, you ask people about. I'm a sucker for a great insight, David. Like, I've fallen out of my chair so many times, just like, damn, you just like blew my mind, right? Like I feel so much smarter about the world because of what you just said. I'm a sucker for a great story and, things that people have gone through and how they learn them and those, tips, tools and techniques. It's like, give me that, like, how do you do that? How do you operationalize that insight? Um, I, I can do that all day long. And, part of my goal in life is like, it's sort of, I always feel like you've got three ages, right? Like there's your chronological age. And then there's like, how wise are you? And so part of my goal is to be wiser than my chronological age. And then the third age is like, how young at heart can you stay? And that's partly in my loft behind me. There is a pool table, a foosball table, and a ping pong table. So.
I don't know how other people felt. I was quite surprised when you were leaving the New York Times to join the ExCo Group, and it's also just a very different job and it's a different path. Why make that decision? Was that something you always wanted to do or something that you felt, now I've collected all this information, I've written books, I've done all of this, but the way I like what I've never asked you that question before, and I'm curious, like what was the turning point there?
Yeah. So, as I said, a journalist for 30 years and 18 years in the New York Times. And, my dream from a pretty young age was to be a journalist. In my early 20s, I said, man, I would kill to work in the New York Times someday. And, I got there like when I was 30 years old. And I did a lot of different jobs and had a lot of the highs and, a few of the lows and stuff. But like you do something for 30 years and, I just had sort of all the experiences and launch and corner office in 2009. And I did it for almost a decade. It was a side project. So my day jobs was managing teams of reporters, but corner office was a side project. I would interview
Mm.
CEOs like you at lunch or, before the day started, whatever. And I would condense the interviews on my train ride home to Westchester. So it was always this side project. And you do that. And it's like I did 525 interviews, never missed a week, started writing books on the side, teaching leadership at Columbia. And I just, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all cliches, right? But it's sort of, cliche moment of I wanted to turn my side passion project into my day job. Right. And it's not because I didn't love my day job, but I'd done it for 30 years. And done pretty much every job I wanted
Mm.
and had all those experience. So, um, again, the beauty of interviewing 525 CEOs is you meet people. I
Yeah.
meet people like
Yeah.
you, David. I also met another David, a guy named David Reimer, who is the CEO of the firm I work for now. And I had no intention of leaving the Times, right? I sort of had New York Times ink in my blood. But David and I became just friends sort of
Mm.
organically. He'd be in town, we'd grab a coffee, a meal, a drink, whatever. And when I started thinking, it's like, oh, I actually wanted to turn this passion project into my day job. And at ExCo, our core business is leadership development, executive mentoring. And I can basically take my approach. I wear a lot of hats at the firm, but a big one is around content. I've got 4 interview series on LinkedIn with about 250,000 subscribers and, interviewing CEOs and board directors and heads of HR. Again, sticking to my swim lane of interviewing leaders about leadership, not about their
Mm.
companies. So from a certain angle, it looks like journalism and consulting, that seems very different. From another angle, I feel like I'm using a lot of the same muscles and really just kind of exploring, this sort of little niche about like, because leadership is like a big field, but I feel like I've locked in for me on what meaningful leadership advice looks like
Mm.
and exploring that and ultimately sharing it. Because the reason I do this is like, if I can help people be better leaders, like that's a really good day. And I also think there's too many bad bosses in the world. And if I can convert some of those bad bosses to not so bad bosses, like that's also a good day.
I love, I love the LinkedIn series that you have. Is that it feels like you do more writing arguably than at at the New York Times, at least from afar. It feels like it's more than the corner office.
It it is. I feel like I'm, almost back to my reporting days where I was like writing all the time because I've written a couple more books and magazine articles and the interview series and but it's fun. It's just, it's fun because I keep learning stuff. And sometimes people say like, don't you get bored? And it's like, I do not get bored because people who have led organizations, they've got great insights and great stories and stuff. And again, I'm a sucker for that stuff all day long.
I like when you added like the CHRO, the HR, like that one was because I think it's it's like similar but different, in terms of that function, I think. And it's but it's of course tied to people and leadership and all of that. So I thought that was a really interesting expansion. The board directors, many times they are similar, kinds of people, but the HR one was for me an interesting expansion, of the audience.
Yeah, and very quick note on that. I mean, we started that series before the pandemic, but in I think the 2008 financial crisis was kind of like the CFO's crisis, right? Like you've got to get us out of this. But I think the last 4 years in the pandemic, that has been HR's crisis. Like, historically you talk to HR leaders and like 30 years ago, it was all about like, we want a seat at the table. And it's like, it is your table now, right?
Mm.
You don't just have a seat at the table. Like every new problem that rolls up to the company, everybody just looks down the table at the CHRO and say, you've got this, right? Like this is yours.
Let's talk about actually the last 4 years. I think um, last 4 years, no matter how you cut it, have been tough. You've been interviewing leaders for 30 years. Do you think this is the toughest 4 year window ever? Do you think the financial crisis was worse? Do you think the dot com? Like where do you rank this, I guess, in your experience? Where do you rank these last 4 years?
Yeah, I think leadership has gotten a lot tougher. I mean, pick a number, 3x, 5x, 10x, right? But like there's an X there. And I think partly it's just sort of the endless disruption, right? And it just seems like the pace of disruption, just when you think you got things on track, like, there's a 18 wheeler that comes out of your side view and like, supply chain or, whatever, but it's just sort of that constant, like, oh no, like these once in a lifetime events seem to be happening every 2 years now. Right. Right. So you take that, but also just it is remarkable for people like me who grew up like in the sort of Gordon Gecko, like business is bad. And, it's all just like, serving investors and all that. you think about the evolution. I mean, all the trust surveys show now that like businesses is at the top of the trust index, right? Like you never would have expected that
Mhm. Mhm.
30 years ago. And in many ways, like people are now looking to companies to solve all society problems, right? All the problems seem to be rolling past the doors of government agencies to business. Okay, you guys solve this. And partly because they can, right? And our political world is so divided, right? So people are looking to business to address all these broader societal problems. And then on top of that, like with the pandemic, you add in, it's like, okay, we got to take care of our employees. So we have to take care about their safety, got that, get the order equipment. But it's like, oh, we also have to take care of your mental health now too. And because everybody is, the pandemic was kind of looking in the mirror and saying, what's the meaning of life? Right. Companies also then had to provide more sense of purpose, right. And mission and all that so that there was that emotion. It's like, wow, this keeps getting harder. And so to me, it's just like all these additional layers, and many of them do manifest as these paradoxes, right? These balancing acts. So, you're a manager, you're a leader, you've got employees going through a lot, because certainly during the pandemic, right? Everybody, family members, all that other stuff, like you're supposed to be compassionate, but at what point, like, where does that end?
Mm.
And where does that end? When does it just turn into therapy? And like, they got to do their job, right? So like, balancing compassion, but also holding people accountable for performance. I feel like people are always trying to figure that out, especially with, quiet quitting. We went through
Mm.
that. Um, and as companies are being pulled off the fence to take stands on broader societal issues, like that's a whole layer of complexity, right? And sometimes even just staying on the fence is taking a
Yeah.
stand, right? And so then you sort of morph into, okay, companies are supposed to be inclusive, right? But you're supposed to stand for something. So how do you square those? Right? Because if everybody is supposed to have a sense of belonging at the company and yet you're supposed to stand for something, like what if the people on your team disagree? Like there's just all these new nuanced problems for which there is no obvious answer. And so that's why I think leadership has gotten so much
Mm.
harder. And I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Well, every interview I do, I ask the person, what is the biggest challenge you faced at your current company? What did you do to overcome it? I ask everyone the same question. And every single person so far, it has been a story during the last 4 years. Even people with 12-year-old companies, 15 been part of like it's something related to the last 4 years. And almost all of them bring up a actual business problem, supply chain, um, physical office business that gets shut down, like all things that are related to the business. Everything you just said is in addition, it's like in addition to that, the last 4 years has probably been the most complicated as it relates to the people. And one of the CEOs I spoke with, he said, the entire time I was so worried about all the things I had to worry for my team and their safety and their jobs and their this. But at the same time, the company was literally collapsing. And the team didn't give me any credit for the fact that I'm holding up the company over here while taking care of them over here. I've heard that same thing now. And that probably is a unique moment of how many crazy things have happened to businesses while at the same thing at time that they're having to deal with the people that I think it is. I haven't been operating for 40 years, so it's hard for me to go back far enough to say, is it the worst? But at least in my career, I don't know how could you have more complexity at one time? I don't know.
Yeah. And then we go back to like who would want these jobs, right? Because they have gotten so much harder.
Yeah.
And every day is this sort of, I feel like part of leadership is that it's like every day there's a new wheelbarrow of Rubik's cubes you've never seen before that are like dumped at your desk, right? And it's like, okay, you try and solve it, and then tomorrow there's going to be a new wheelbarrow of Rubik's cubes you've never seen before. And you that's why it's like, well, why do people do this? Why do and part is like you've got to have a certain amount of stamina and energy, and you got to see all those Rubik's cubes as kind of interesting and exciting and challenging and opportunities. Because if it was like, please don't give me another like Rubik's Cube, like you're in the wrong job, right?
Let me ask you. So you've written 4 books, great books. Do you think you'll ever write a fifth, sixth, seventh? Like I haven't written. I mean, I've written one as it related to for SaaS stuff, but like it was so hard to write those, and those are not even close to what you've done.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll go through that pain again?
Right. Speaking of why do
Yeah,
people do
yeah,
this,
yeah.
right? Yeah, I probably will. I mean, I wrote 2 books in 4 years. And after that, by the time I finished the second one in that period, I found like, speaking of like OBOB and,
Yeah.
how your brain works, I found myself immediately thinking it's like, what's the next? And I stopped myself. I said, take a break, take a year, and just like don't write a book. Because to me, writing a book is kind of all consuming. I mean, the metaphor for me when I start writing a book is like I'm standing at the base of a very big mountain and I'm looking up and I don't know how tall the mountain is. And there's a mountain range behind the mountain. I don't know how long that is. I don't know the path. And like and sort of and so to me, like you've got to have a certain amount of like commitment and passion for the topic and just know that it's like you suit up, like your knuckles are going to get bloody. There's going to be times where you're asking yourself, man, like, why am I doing this? But then, like a year goes by and you're suddenly on the other side of the mountain range on level ground again. So
Well, it's. I think I don't know, but I there was one time I wrote this book about managing SaaS applications and everything, and I went to a customer's office, and I'll never forget that they had it on their desk with post-it notes of, and there was probably like 10 people who read that book, but that feeling to me, I think
oh,
about you and say like, wow, you must think like all these leaders reading all this material, taking all that knowledge. That's like a pretty amazing, just the impact you can have is multiplied so many different times, when
yeah.
you do that. Do you think about that? Like,
I do. And when you get those notes back from people, I mean, it is so rewarding, right? Like if some shared some insight with them. And again, like, you know, I would say like, I am not a leadership guru and or anything like that. It's just like, because I have taken this sort of journalistic reportorial approach to understanding leadership, like I feel like in my brain, I've got the collective wisdom of more than a
yeah.
thousand leaders, and I get excited about sharing that. So it's, and I try and do my pattern matching. I know, like, isn't this interesting? And you see the connections, and that's kind of what the books are about. But yeah, it's always rewarding when you hear that, like, you see like somebody shows you their book and they wore
Yeah.
out a highlighter on passages or the post-it
Yeah.
notes, and it's super gratifying.
For the ExCo Group, can you just talk maybe a little bit about? You talked about it a little before, but I would love to just get, who do you work with? What people listening to this, should they reach out to you? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. So our core business is one-on-one mentoring or coaching at the C-suite level. So C-suite, C-1, -2. There's a ton of coaches out there. The thing that sets us apart is that all our coaches are former CEOs or global business leaders. So they've been in the chair like you, felt the weight on their back. And so that's kind of our differentiator. That's our core business. We work with like Fortune 20 companies, private equity, VC, family
so full
businesses,
spectrum, full spectrum.
full spectrum. And we actually typically don't match our coaches based on industry background, because we find there's a lot of magic in, somebody from a CPG company, pairing up with a mentor who worked in oil and gas. But the point is like leadership,
Mm,
right? It's
hmm.
about knowing the right questions to ask and clarity. But we also do a lot of work with teams, helping them operate like true teams. And we're getting pulled more and more into board work around succession and executive assessment, because there's just this, like, I feel like so much is changing in the world of, I mean, stating the obvious, right? Organizations, companies, leadership. And I think one of the most consistent themes we are hearing is that people are telling us that the playbooks that they've been running for the last 20 or 30 years just don't work in this environment. Like
Mm.
maybe they worked when the world was more stable, right? And a little more predictable, but just with, there's so much churn and uncertainty. There's this sense of like, we need to have a new conversation, a new way of thinking about this. And so and we love to have those
Mm.
conversations. So that's kind of our firm.
I really like the succession planning stuff. I did not do that until late, and I feel like once I started doing that really deliberately, it completely changed my view on the team. It changed my view on who I needed to hire. It changed how to invest in the people on the team, and it also changed actually the conversations with the top people on the team to tell them there is a place for you to move into, versus, oh, I have to leave to get that another job to get that. And I never, people who would say succession planning to me, my head of HR, and I never really gave it the credit. And I love that that's an area. It is so, I've been helping a lot of the companies I'm advising, just giving them how I did it, not in some in depth way, but just to think about it and to put effort into it. It like, I think it also gives you as CEO and as a board, obviously, a lot of peace of mind that someone's not going to
Right.
show up one day and say, I'm gone. And then the whole company falls, you're like starting to chase them. Please stay, please begging, versus, okay, that makes sense. You're ready to go. We already have the person ready to step into those shoes. I love that. I love that.
Yeah. And you and I know that a lot of people don't do proper
Yeah.
succession planning, right? Because it seems like almost every day there's some headline about some big company where, like the CEO was clearly not a good fit for the company and they get kicked out or whatever. But just like there's, there's how you should do it. But the reality is a lot of people, they don't spend the proper time and then they make decisions because somebody looks like a CEO. It's like, give it to Bob, he's 6'2", he looks good. He's got like that chiseled jaw. Like that's not how you do succession planning.
um, Last question for you. Knowing everything you know today, your entire career, everything you've done in your career, if you could go back to the very beginning of your career before you started your first job and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think I would probably tell myself to enjoy the journey more. Because I've always been very goal oriented and very much like, achievements. Like I need to do this and accomplish this. And I don't mean in terms of title because I've actually turned down 2 promotions in my career. So I've never been focused on like, I got to get to that next rung, but more like accomplishing different things. And so sometimes I feel like the way my brain works, I'm sometimes scanning the horizon too much instead of like being present and enjoying this. Cause like, and partly like I was an editor for 15 years at the New York Times and Newsweek. It's like your job is to scan the horizon, right? Like what are we missing? The story's breaking. Like what are the 5 angles that could play out? Like what else is going on and trying to spot patterns and see what's missing. I mean, it's almost like being an idea entrepreneur. Like nobody's articulated this insight. And so the way my brain works is partly it's like, it's just that kind of like constantly scanning the horizon. So I think my advice to myself, and I'm working on it now, partly why like I'm living in New Orleans where our 2 daughters moved. But New Orleans is a great place to sort of like, the vibe here is just like, do what you're doing when you're doing it and enjoy it. And it's a good, I, I like living here because it's a good counterweight for me. Cause more naturally, I'm like, scanning that horizon, living in the future a bit.
I love that advice. I could probably use that. Um, Adam, thank you for doing this with me. You've been really helpful for me on my journey in so many different ways. Your content, your friendship, your mentorship. So thank you very much. And I know people are gonna love this. And there's just people could probably listen to this 5 times and catch 10 new things each time. So thank you very much.
No, I appreciate it. I'll always enjoy our conversations, David, and love what you're doing with this podcast. You just, it's cool to watch you create something.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, hopefully everyone you enjoyed the episode. If you did, like, subscribe, share it with your networks, and we'll see you for the next episode of Not Another CEO podcast. That's a wrap for this week's episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. Thanks for joining. For show notes and more, please visit notanotherceopodcast.com. We'll see you next week.